Good evening. Thank you so much for coming to our inaugural education policy workshop. So poor Doug did not know that he was going to get to kick us off when he graciously agreed to speak this evening. But he is, of course, going to set an incredibly high bar that it's going to be very difficult for other speakers to meet. The Education Policy Workshop is basically an opportunity to hear a research in progress. So as I understand it, this work is going to be ready for public release in a couple of weeks, so we're getting a sneak peek at some work that's coming out. And hear not only research findings, but also about the process by which the researchers come to those particular decisions. Doug Harris, who is our featured guest this evening, is a professor of economics and the Schleter Foundation Chair in Public Education at Tulane University. So he also serves currently as the director of the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans. And in that role, he supervises the work of a number of postdoctoral fellows and scholars who are interested in exploring the consequences of the enormous changes that have occurred in New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. So I could go on and on about how deeply envious I am of Doug's CV and how many lovely pieces he has written, including that excellent piece that we co-authored on behalf of the National Academy of Science, and someday might actually get published. But rather than brag on him, I'd like to hear him talk. So if you please help me welcome to the stage Doug Harris.
Thank you very much. So I understand the correct greeting is howdy. So, howdy. There we go. In New Orleans, it's hey y'all, but to each his own. Well, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here at the Bush Library and to have the inaugural talk on ed policy and to have so many of you here, so I appreciate that. So we're going to talk about New Orleans, we're going to talk about Katrina, and I think this topic is interesting on a lot of different levels, and I know, having spent a few hours with some of the students, that there are a lot of different angles that people are coming at this from themselves. So I think that what happened with Katrina speaks to us about urban school reform, but it speaks to us more broadly about just urban development in general, about poverty, about a lot of the things that we're hearing about right now in the news, about the Flint water crisis. I think all of these issues are connected about what's going on in cities. Why do we see this growth in poverty? What can we do about it? What are the role of schools in this? So I think all of what we'll talk about here today will touch on those issues. I'm going to focus somewhat narrowly on the effects on academic outcomes of students, but along the way, a lot of these other pieces are going to get brought in. Let me first thank Lori for having me here. Lori and I have known each other for many years and been good friends and colleagues going back many years. And I want to thank Matthew Larson, who is my co-author on a lot of this work here. So let's go back to the beginning here on what happened with Katrina. Let me say a little bit about Katrina itself, for those of you who might not be familiar, and then also about where the district was at the time. So Katrina was one of the worst tragedies in American history. There was $100 billion in physical damage, 3,000 people died. The city was evacuated almost completely for about 3 or 4 months before they let people come back in. For the students, this was a terrible tragedy, right? What they had to go through, nobody should have to go through. And that's one of the reasons why I went to Tulane. It's one of the reasons why I started the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans, was to try to understand this better. I think we had an obligation to do that given what they had gone through, to try to learn from this disaster and learn from what they went through. And then to see whether it worked, right? I think they deserve to know whether this radically new system that they got was working. So that's where we're coming at it from. So what was the district like beforehand? What was the school system like that they were experiencing? It was quite bad. Now, urban districts tend to have problems, and New Orleans was like a lot of them. It was also like them in terms of how the system was designed. So New Orleans was starting down the path in 2005. That's when Katrina hit. They were starting down the path of reform. They had a few charter schools, they had a few magnet schools. They had intra-district choice, meaning that students could pick schools in other parts of the city if they wanted to. They had a union contract. They had some test-based accountability. NCLB had passed in 2001, came into effect in 2002, so some of that was coming in at this time. All of that is like most districts at the time, so it was not too different. And the education scholars and historians call this the one best system. It's the system that almost every district in the country had. Right? You had a publicly elected, locally elected school board managing the schools. You had students assigned to schools based on their attendance zones mostly. You had a union contract that governed a lot of the human capital and personnel side of the story. And then ultimately, people answered to the superintendent who was selected by that school board. And so that was the system. That's a system that most places have. I imagine you have a system like that here in College Station as well. In other respects, New Orleans was quite different. So it was actually much worse than most urban districts in terms of its performance. There was so much corruption in New Orleans before Katrina that the FBI had a field office located within the school district offices. Not kidding. The school board president at the time Katrina hit eventually went to jail. That was not uncommon. Lots of people from the district went to jail. And so that was obviously a signal of how it was run. It was also the second lowest performing district in the second lowest performing state. So it wasn't just kind of general urban district problems. It was quite severe. Then comes Katrina. So the city empties out. I could go on for a long time about how the system got put in place, but the short answer is the city had no political capital or apparatus after Katrina. So there were a few state leaders, a few local leaders who largely decided what happened. They were elected leaders, most of them, not all of them. Some of them were elected, some of them weren't. But they ultimately just had to make these decisions because there wasn't an easy opportunity to have community input in the way we normally would have these things. And in fact, that lack of input is partly what made it possible to do this, because if it had gone through the usual political processes, none of this reform would have happened, certainly not this way. So what happened? What were the reforms? So I think about it as a package for reasons that I'll explain here in a minute. But one was that they fired all the teachers, literally fired all of them. They let the union contract expire. And since they were moving the schools over to charter status, once they did that, then even if a new union contract had been developed, the teachers would not have been subject to it because the charter schools were their own entities. So the teachers were fired, no union contract. Everybody was fired, so the new schools that were being created, they could hire whoever they wanted and manage them however they wanted. There was choice and competition, so they got rid of attendance zones. They were completely. They're no longer assigning students to schools at all based on their location. That students had to choose. They had to make a choice where they wanted to go to school. And of course, it was not a free and open choice in the sense that some schools were more popular than others, so not everybody could get their top choice, but at least in principle, everybody could pick any school they wanted. So that meant that schools were competing for students, so funding was on a per pupil basis. The schools, if they didn't get sufficient enrollments, they couldn't survive, so it created this competitive environment. The third piece there, test-based accountability. So in most states, and I already mentioned No Child Left Behind, that testing was a big part of the accountability system, but it was much more intense in New Orleans after the reforms because they actually shut down low-performing schools based on test scores. So in lots of places they talk about doing that, but usually the most extreme thing that has happened really anywhere else is maybe you fire the principal, you get a new principal, or another extreme version would be to get rid of a third of the teachers of the school and hire new ones. Here they were completely shutting them down and on a regular basis over especially the first 6 or 7 years. So this is very intense test-based accountability. And I already mentioned that they turned them over to charter operators. So you have these 4 different pillars of the reforms. And I think part of what's interesting and part of what's important about the story is that if you look at this list, it should look really familiar because if you look at ed policy circles, this is what people have been trying to do, that reformers have been trying to do for 20 years. Right? Charter schools, choice, autonomy, market-based competition, changes in the teacher workforce. This is what the reform movement has been about for 20 years. But no district had ever gone very far with it. So you have some districts who they had test-based accountability. They might fire the principal if things weren't going well, but they wouldn't shut down schools. You got some districts later with the race to the top that would have some teacher accountability, but very rarely would teachers lose their jobs in most places, especially if they already had tenure. So, New Orleans, they were doing all of these things at once and doing it really intensively, far more intensively than anybody had ever done it before. So I think that's one of the reasons why we really need to learn about this, partly because of the tragedy, but partly because this is sort of the logical end of 20 years of school reform. Now, there was one other thing that happened that doesn't get as much attention, which is they put a lot more money into the system at the same time. So this was not something where they were trying to just save money. They put a lot of additional resources in. So we'll talk about that as well as we go along. All right, so I think I've summarized most of the motivation here. One, it's the first time a traditional school district has essentially been eliminated. That's basically what happened here. Others are now following suit, paying very close attention to what's going on in New Orleans, and this issue of autonomy and accountability as being the principles around which school reform has been developed over the last 2 decades. So let me just preview the results and then explain how we got to these conclusions. So first, the New Orleans school reforms had a very large positive effect on student outcomes, larger effects than I've ever seen any policy or program of any kind before, and done at scale, which makes it all the more remarkable. It wasn't like we just did an intervention in one classroom and got the test scores way up. This is the entire district had these very large effects. And even though there was more money put in, it still looks like it was cost effective. So I'll show you a little bit of cost effectiveness analysis at the end. From an equity standpoint, the results are also generally positive in the sense that all groups benefited, although disadvantaged students benefited less. So even though it looks like disadvantaged students benefited, they were doing better too. After the reforms, more advantaged students did benefit more than they did. And finally, the big question, I think, for audiences outside of New Orleans is, what does this mean for me, right? What does this mean for College Station and Austin and Houston and Dallas and other cities that are grappling with school reform? I think it's a lot less clear what it means for everybody else, and we'll talk later about the reasons why it's not that clear. But I do think it gives you a sense of what's possible and what's sort of a best case scenario. So this is just a graph of test scores over time in New Orleans. This happens to be math in grades 3 through 5. So if you look at the left-hand side of that, you see the pre-Katrina period. Things are jumping around a little bit. And then you see 2006, which is really sort of this lost year where there were very few students back in the district. So we're always just going to drop 2006. And that also makes it easier for you to see when the hurricane happened. And then you see this steady upward climb in scores after. So this is sort of our first signal that things got better. And when I first went down to New Orleans and saw these graphs, my immediate thought was, and everybody in the research methods class should know what I'm about to say, correlation is not causation, right? So it could be that these scores went up for reasons that didn't have to do with the reforms. And so when I first went down there, I made that point. The reformers were not too pleased when I made that point because they thought they knew the reason for the improvement, but I wasn't sure. And we wanted to be fair to the critics, to the concerns that they were raising about the other explanations. But these are big improvements. So if you just look at this just descriptively, right, we're starting off here at about 0.55 standard deviations below the state average. So part of what this picture is telling you is that New Orleans was way behind to begin with, right? This is a huge gap below the state. So the state average is up here, somewhere up in the title. You can't even see it. They're so far away from the mean. And this improvement takes you from about 0.55 to about 0.3, negative 0.3. So this is an improvement of about, on this particular graph, of about 0.25 standard deviations. That's gigantic. So usually when we study a school program of any sort, we were lucky to find a 0.05 to 0.1. This is 2 to 4 times larger. If we interpret it as an effect, which we're not at this point, that's how big it would be. So it just looks really big. And this is now just a graph showing you even more of those pictures. So this is now the 6th through 8th grade math up here. This is grade 3 through 5 English language arts. That's grade 6 through 8 English language arts. And you see basically the same story. You see this starting after the reforms, this substantial improvement. Okay, so this is our first signal that maybe things got better. Nope, actually didn't fill in that one, so we're going to skip that. The ranking of the district also improved dramatically to the point where it was second lowest in the state. It's now almost to the median district in the state. So that's just another way of looking at those results. All right, so I said correlation is not causation. So what are all the possible alternative explanations here that we have to grapple with? So this gives you a sense of the research challenge we had when we started this. So some of the factors here are likely to bias the effects upwards, meaning that when we look at those trends, it's going to make the effects look too big relative to what they really were. One is population change. So after Katrina, everybody moved out, but guess who moved back more quickly, right? Richer people, right? They're the ones who were in less flooded areas. They're the ones who had money to come back. So you might expect population change to make things look better, because if you get the higher income families coming back, they're going to have higher scores. That's going to make the scores look better by itself, separate from anything the reforms might do. Second, you have the distortions from test-based accountability. So if you're going to put so much attention on these tests, then schools have really strong incentives to get the scores up. And they might do things like teach to the test, which is debatable as to whether that's a good thing or not, but that's going to get the scores up in ways that are probably not real in the sense of generating long-term achievement growth. And there might also be worse responses. So there have been cases like in Atlanta, the well-known cheating scandal in Atlanta as well. The third factor is the interim schools. So everybody left, and they went to different schools temporarily, right? They left New Orleans, a lot of them went to Baton Rouge, a lot of them went to Houston, and it looks like they ended up in better schools, and especially the New Orleans students who left ended up in better schools than people who left other hurricane-affected areas. So they benefited in terms of school quality alone, they benefited. So that might also raise their scores, and that too wouldn't have anything to do with the school reform. That's just an artifact of the schools that they were in temporarily. So another possibility works in the other direction, right? The students went through hell for at least a year. They lost their homes, they lost their possessions. Almost everybody, especially in a public school, knew somebody who died in the in the storm. So naturally, that's going to push things down, right? When you come back, you've gone through that kind of a trauma, that's going to push your outcomes down. And there are a couple other factors that work in unclear directions. So one is other changes in state policy. So some of that could have to do with No Child Left Behind. And the last one there is about changes in the test scale. So anybody who's really examined test scores very well knows that the test isn't the same year over year. And there are also some changes in the test design here that complicate it, especially when you're at the very low end of the scale, and most everybody else is more in the middle of the scale. All right, so I'm going to use this picture here to sort of help you keep track of all the things that we're doing to try to show whether this is causal or not. So on the right-hand side, it's empty now, but I'm going to show you all the things that we did. So our basic strategy is what we call a difference in difference analysis with a matched comparison group. So in simple terms, all this means is that we're taking New Orleans before and after, and we're comparing that to a comparison group before and after. So we have the differences before and after, and then that same difference with the comparison group. And we're going to do 3 different versions of this. One is what we call a panel, which means we're following the exact same students before and after, because a lot of students came back. The second is what we call pooled cohorts, which means we're looking at third graders before to third graders after, which is less ideal but has some advantages that I'll describe. And another is called a switcher analysis, which means we can look at students who, say, switched from 2003 to 2004, they switched into New Orleans, and then other students switched into New Orleans in, say, 2010 to 2011, and we can look at the one-year gains that came with switching, and we can look at that before and after the reforms as a third possibility. Fortunately, it looks like these results all give us the same answer, which is part of why we have confidence in these results. Okay, so the data only go through middle school. That's an important issue. We're going up through 2012 We just recently got the data to get us to 2014, but this is only going to get us to 2012. And this is what I'm going to call getting us through the first two phases of the reform. The initial sort of upheaval and changes in the policy, and then phase two, which was really getting the charter schools in place. It took a while to turn these things into charter schools. All right, so these are the simple equations. For those of you who think in equations, these are just standard operating procedure. The first one there is just a simple difference looking at the 2005 versus 2012, and the one underneath is a fancy way of saying we're going to look at that effect each specific year, not just looking at two periods, but looking at every single year separately. So let me say more about the panel versus the pooled approach. So with the panel approach, the advantage is we're following the exact same people over time. The nice thing about that is we don't have to worry about their characteristics being different. It's exactly the same people over time. So that's helpful. The problem is it's a very small group, so we're losing a lot of students in the process. Another problem is we eventually run out of test scores, because once the students get to 8th grade, and we need two test scores before Katrina, then we lose 2006. In some cases, we lose 2007. And then they come back, and once they get to 8th grade, then we have to stop studying them anymore because they just run out of test scores. And that's unfortunate because in 2009, which is the last year we can study in that analysis, a lot of the reforms hadn't really taken hold. So at that point, we're not really seeing the effects. So with the pooled analysis, it solves that problem because we can use the pooled strategy forever, right? We can keep looking at the next cohort of 3rd graders over and over again. The disadvantage is it's not the same students anymore, so we worry about the population change in that analysis. Okay, so let's talk about this matching approach. So we're really careful about this. This is really where most of the time went in to the analysis. So we wanted to address the trauma and disruption and the interim schools effect. So the first thing we did was to limit the comparison to only other hurricane affected districts. So there were 8 districts that were hurricane affected, meaning that they had a substantial number of students who had to not be attending school for a time. New Orleans was, however, hit harder than all but 2 of those districts. So that's not perfect, but it's a starting point. To address the policy changes that might have differently affected students at the low end of the test score distribution, we matched on their pre-hurricane scores. In other words, we matched, at least in the panel analysis, we were able to match students who had similar scores beforehand. That way, if the policies were affecting students at the low end of the distribution, then that would also affect the comparison group too. All right, so the matching is really important. Let me talk about it a little bit separately for the panel and the pooled because it works differently in the 2 cases. So we're going to find a match with replacement for each New Orleans student within each comparison district. So if there's New Orleans as one, then 7 comparison districts. We're going to take each New Orleans student pre-Katrina and go out and find a match in these other districts. This only applies to students who came back, right? So these are the returnees, we call them. And then what we do is we take all of those people we've matched together and we create what we call a pseudo-district. So the district next door is not the entire district as the comparison group, it's only those who matched to a New Orleans student. And then we're going to do that whole thing 2 different ways. So one case we're going to do it based on matching only on test scores because we think that's going to be the most important thing to match on. But then we also do a version where we match on whether a student had ever been retained in grade, what year they returned, and their student demographics. So we're going to do it. All of these things we're doing a couple different ways because there's generally a rationale for doing it some other approach. And what makes the analyses convincing is that we triangulate and hopefully find the same results across methods. Now the pooled analysis is more complicated because we can't match on post-treatment information. So this is just a general rule of research. You never want to try to match based on something that happened after whatever thing is that you studied. So what we did instead was to identify schools in the pre-Katrina period that matched up well with schools in the pre-Katrina period in New Orleans, and then take that same group of schools in the post-Katrina period. So we're matching based entirely on the pre-Katrina information, but then just taking that same group of schools in the post-Katrina period. It doesn't work as well as I'm going to show you here right now. So here's how it looks. So we've got a bunch of different columns here, and let me explain. So these are the demographics of the students. These are the test scores of the students. In the paper, this table goes down to the floor. But this is the panel. So this is the characteristics of the students who returned. this is the characteristics in New Orleans of the entire district. Since it's pooled, we don't have to throw anybody out here. They didn't have to return. Whether they returned or not, they're in here. And then we did the same thing for the other hurricane-affected districts. And then we took the difference. So it's really these last two columns that I want to highlight. So if you look at the far right upper part there, you can see that there were differences between New Orleans and the other hurricane-affected districts in the pooled analysis especially. If you look at that far right, that 0.271 means that there were differences in between here and here. That difference gets you that, meaning that we didn't get a perfect match. If these were perfect matches, then all these numbers would be 0. Right? So the fact that we don't see zeros over in those right-hand columns means that there are differences between New Orleans and the comparison group at baseline before the reforms. Some things work better than others, so if you look at percent Hispanic, percent other race, looks reasonably similar, but New Orleans has a much larger African-American population, larger share than any other district in New Orleans, in the state of Louisiana, and so that's why that looks different. If you look at test scores, in the pooled analysis, things also look bad, right? So the difference unadjusted in New Orleans is about 0.5 to 0.6 standard deviations compared to the whole state. It gets a little bit better here, but it's still the case that the New Orleans students are much lower performing at baseline than the comparison. Not much we can do about that in the pool because we're matching at the school level. That's why that happens. In the panel analysis, it reverses, so it doesn't match as well on the demographics, but matches better on test scores. So we get the differences down to about 0.15 standard deviation. So it gets a little bit better. The point of this is to see how well we match. So what you want is for the treatment and comparison groups to look as similar as possible. What this is telling us is they look more similar than they would have without the matching process, but we still have a ways to go. Now, the other key message here is that we need to worry as much about what we call the parallel trends. We're as worried not just about the levels, but whether they were on the same trajectory beforehand. So I'm going to show you that information here in a minute. I'm going to skip this part just for sake of time because I can tell I'm a little bit behind where I need to be. Let's come back to this table showing you what we've done. So remember I said there are 6 problems, 6 alternative interpretations here. What I've shown you so far, just with the matching process alone, deals with 4 of them reasonably well. And with population change, the panel is especially effective because it's the same students. So population change, again, doesn't have an effect on the panel analysis. All right, so this is just, again, sort of keeping score and giving you a sense of how we're dealing with each of our problems. All right, so now let me get to different patterns we might see in the data. So what I'm going to show you in a minute is, again, sort of years on this axis, student outcomes, especially test scores on this axis. This line indicates the difference between New Orleans and the comparison group. Right, so this is a flat line. We want that to be flat because that's what tells us we have a parallel trend. That means that the two were on the same path. And that's before the reforms. Then we have the gap, and then if there's an effect, it's probably going to look like this. And the reason it's probably going to look like this is because of the way the reforms were implemented. So in the early period after Katrina, you had a few charters, but the charters hadn't really taken hold yet. You had fired teachers, but most of the teachers who got hired back were still pre-Katrina teachers. So you hadn't really changed the teacher workforce that much. You hadn't really turned over the schools to the operators who eventually came in at the beginning. In phase 2, you got more of that changing. That the system started to settle down by about 2012. Almost all the schools were charter schools by the end of that period. The teacher workforce changed a lot from the beginning of the reforms. And so that's why we expect this to be gradual, right? So if it were a sudden shift, if things got suddenly better, this would still be a flat line. It would just be a flat line up here. But in reality, this is really what we expect given the way the reforms were implemented. All right, so if the effect was positive and we eliminated the biases, this is what we should see. And so the punchline is, in the preview is, this is what we see. That's what I'm going to show you in a minute. But there's some other things we could have seen, right? So if there was actually no effect and the patterns were just reflecting bias, say from population change, we'd expect to see this, right? Because the test scores would go up after the reforms because the higher income families came back first. Then over time, the population became more like it was before, and so we'd expect to see the outcomes converge back to where they were before, if it was just population change. If it was trauma and disruption, we'd expect a drop here, right? Because the trauma and disruption would make the scores go down. Eventually, hopefully, the trauma and disruption effects would go away, and again, things would converge back. If it was test-based accountability bias, meaning this teaching to the test and so on, we'd expect to see a sudden increase in scores and then a parallel trend, meaning that it would get better, but then it wouldn't get better for long. It would go up and then it would stay flat. And we'd expect that to be even more true in math and English language arts because the accountability is stronger on those subjects than they are in social studies and science. Right, so this is what we'd expect if it's test-based accountability that's driving things. All right, a couple other nitty methodological things, and then I'll show you the graphs. So there's an issue here of at what level of aggregation we apply these data. So we did it both ways. In some cases, we estimate at the student level and then do what we call a cluster error, clustered at the district level. In other cases, we just aggregate the data up to the district so that each observation is just a district by year. That turns out not to have much of an effect, so I'm going to skip by that. So here are the results. So this is the panel method using method 1, just matching on test scores. So what we see here is a little bit of evidence of maybe trauma effect followed by improvement. So if you look by the end of this period of 2009, this is a positive, this is 0.1 standard deviation. It's not statistically significant. So at this point, we would conclude no effect. This is just the same thing for other subjects. So this is English language arts, again, no effect, but the upward trajectory, no effect, upward trajectory, no effect, sort of uneven trajectory on social studies. So we just stopped here. We would conclude that there was no effect. But that wouldn't be wise, right? Because we know, based on the way it was implemented, that a lot happened after 2009. This is using the panel method 2. We see basically the same picture, so I'm going to skip through this. Now, with a pooled, remember the advantage is we can keep doing this forever. We can go to 2012. So now my endpoint has changed. And we can now look to that phase 2 of the reforms and see what happened when this thing had more time to take hold. So now we start to see a different picture. First of all, it goes up and up and up. It just keeps going up. This is a almost 0.4 standard deviation effect by 2012. The other thing that's a little bit different here is that there's no downward spike anymore. So that's somewhat expected given that, remember, the panel analysis only returnees, which means you've got more students there who would have been affected by trauma. Whereas in the pooled analysis, some of the students had never been in New Orleans to begin with and had not been hurricane affected. So trauma should have less of an effect here, and so that's what we see. So it looks like the panel results were being pulled down by trauma and disruption to some degree. All right, and the same thing when we look to different subjects. So again, big changes. Again, this is 0.5 standard deviations. This is 0.5 standard deviations. This is 0.3 standard deviations. Gigantic changes. Okay. So why do the results differ? So I gave you some indications, but let me say a little bit more. The poor matching, right? So remember the pooled didn't match as well on test scores as the panel, so that could be part of it. I already mentioned the timing of the implementation and how many years of analysis we have to work with in the two. I mentioned the trauma disruption bias. I didn't mention that only in the student level analysis can we include student level covariates and what we call bin indicators because of the way we did the matching process. So things look a little bit more positive. Well, we hold back on that. Let me say it differently. When we do it at the aggregated level, we can't include the covariates for reasons that are hard to explain here. But because we're not controlling for, say, race and free and reduced lunch and all those things where we saw differences, that might make the results look different. All right. Finally, population change, right? So I mentioned at the beginning that the pooled analysis is subject to population change. That could be what's going on. So now I'm going to spend a couple minutes showing you a few different analyses of population change. So 80% of the city flooded, mostly in low-income neighborhoods. The public housing projects were shut down, never to be reopened. They rebuilt some of them, but they rebuilt using the more dispersed model and many fewer units. So the total number of units is far lower than before. So if you stop there, you'd think, okay, this is population change, right? You just kicked out your low-income kids. But actually, that's not what happened, as it turns out. That's what I thought when I first got there. I thought that's got to be part of the story. But the more I dug, the more it seemed like that wasn't the story. One reason is that the high-income families were not in public schools to begin with. They were in private schools. So that's not affecting any of this analysis. Private school students are not included here. So even though they were able to come back, they're not influencing the results. Second, the black middle class had a huge decline. Partly it was because they fired all the teachers who were disproportionately black. So the black middle class was also cut, and those students often were in the public schools. So you weren't just losing low-income students, you were also losing the middle-class students in the system. And there was also a huge increase in Section 8 housing. So even though the public housing per se was closed down, you actually had more families in total using some sort of housing subsidy or public housing than you did before the reforms. So it looks like, just looking at it in that sense, probably population change is not the main explanation. But here are some numbers to back that up. So this is from the administrative data. So now we're comparing all the people in New Orleans before, just those who came back. And in terms of free and reduced lunch, there's absolutely no difference in a percent free and reduced lunch. This is in 2012, exactly the same as before. And we can do that with the other measures too. So we look at test scores. The full sample before was negative 0.44 standard deviations. Just the returnees actually had lower achievement in 2012 than those who were there before. So this actually points in the other direction, that the returnees actually were worse off academically than those who didn't come back. And then if we also compare that to the comparison districts, and we look at this last column, which is mainly what we're interested in, very, very small change. And if anything, and when we look at the test scores here, it looks like New Orleans was at a disadvantage, not at an advantage in terms of population change effects on scores. All right, then we did this more complicated analysis using census data. The reason that we did this is that the administrative data are not that reliable. Free and reduced lunch is not a great measure of demographics in New Orleans. So we actually worked with the Census Bureau. They ran a special data run for us to get more detailed demographics by district for every district in the state. And then we did a similar kind of analysis and come to a pretty similar conclusion. Bottom line is, doesn't look like there's much of an effect here. What we did was to simulate. We took the changes in census measures and then we simulated the effect on test scores. Since the census doesn't have test scores themselves, we simulated the effect and got a very similar answer to what we get up here. So I'm just going to skip through that. But bottom line is, almost no matter how we look at this, there's no population change effect, and that probably then doesn't influence the differences in results we get between the panel and the pooled. All right, so back to our trusty table here. So we have now dealt with all of the problems to some degree, and we don't see any evidence that these problems are driving the results. So I'm not going to reiterate it all, but that's what that tells us. So we did one other thing. I mentioned this district switcher approach. So we did that. That also yielded quite similar results. So switching into New Orleans is now gives you a much bigger positive bump post-reform than it did pre-reform, and of about the same magnitude as what we see in these other results. All right, so now let me summarize. I've thrown a lot at you. Let me just summarize all of what I've told you in one table. So the first figures I showed you just documented New Orleans by itself, and this shows you the average just raw increase relative to the state. So the increase is about 0.4 standard deviations. This is what we get when we look at, actually I didn't show you this part, year by year anyway. This is what I showed you for the changes in reading scores returnees versus not returnees. This is now adding on the additional year. So at the beginning, there was a little bit of an advantage in terms of population change, right? The higher scoring students came back, but it converged, right? So if you look at this cumulatively, the average advantage dropped and dropped and dropped to the point that it was actually negative in 2012. So that's just reiterating that other table I showed you. This is the result from the census analysis, very small effect. This is the effect of the trauma and disruption effects from a different study that actually looked at the effects of trauma disruption on students. So if you just look at the magnitudes of these overall, they're much smaller than the effect sizes, right? So the effects we're seeing are like 0.2 to 0.4 standard deviations. These things, even if they're real, are much, much smaller, a fraction of what we're seeing of the actual effects. So they couldn't possibly explain the effects that we're seeing. All right, then what we did is we established bounds. We looked for a lower bound and an upper bound from these different combinations of results. So one way to do this is to use the difference between the panel and the pooled as an estimate of the bias. So if we believe the panel more because it's exactly the same students, we might think of the difference between the panel and the pooled as being bias. So since we get a more positive effect in the pooled, we might say, okay, well, the bias here is about 0.14 standard deviations. Let's just take that as an estimate of the bias, and then we can subtract that off the pooled estimate. That's what we get from the pooled. The bias is about 0.2. That gets us a lower bound of about 0.2. So some of this is biased, and so we'll take this lower estimate. Another way to approach it is to ignore the pooled analysis altogether and to take this upward trajectory here and do a linear projection of that to 2012. Since we can't know for sure what the panel analysis would look like through 2009 because we don't have anything past 2009. But we do see this increase. And so if we take the linear increase and project that to 2012, for the two methods, we get about 0.23, which is quite similar to this other lower bound. As an upper bound, we could just take the pooled analysis in 0.4. So whenever you hear me talk about this, whenever you see references to this research, you'll see we always say 0.2 to 0.4 standard deviation increase. That's how we reach the conclusion, is by taking all these different combinations of assumptions to try to establish what's feasible here. Okay, so that suggests then, if we take all that together, that the effects are what we see in those trends initially, that steep increase, that almost all of that's probably explained by the reforms, which is that was the question to begin with. How much of the effect is causal as opposed to just correlation? And so it looks like it was mostly causal. All right. Now let's talk, we've got just a few more minutes here. Effect heterogeneity, meaning how were different groups affected differently? So there are lots of challenges that I'm gonna skip over to doing this. Let me just show you the results, and I'll give you some idea of how confident we should be. The red lines here are the more advantaged groups in every picture. So the red line here is white students, the black line is black students. You can see that both of them are positive, so the hard lines here are the actual estimates, and the dashed lines are the confidence intervals. They're both positive and significant. But just looking at 2009, the effect's bigger for whites. And it's true in every graph. Okay, so whites benefited more than blacks, no matter how you look at it. And we did the same thing based on free and reduced lunch. In the panel, you get the same picture, that the non-free and reduced lunch students benefited more than others, although, again, both are positive and significant for free and reduced lunch and not. You get this weird result in the pooled that it looked like higher income students did dramatically worse, which was really strange, until we learned that any student who was not in their permanent residence in 2007 was considered homeless and therefore eligible for free and reduced lunch. So even if I had lived in New Orleans and come back in 2007, we would have been considered homeless, right? Which is absurd, right? So what happened was you had a lot of, the people who were in the free and reduced lunch category, almost everybody was in the free and reduced lunch category at this point. There's almost nobody in this group. And then as things passed over time, the free and reduced lunch designation meant it meant the more normal low income threshold. And then we start to see the same result again, that the higher income students benefited more. Okay, so again, almost no matter how you look at it, it looks like there's some equity implications here. Everybody's benefiting, but disadvantaged students are benefiting less. That's probably frankly the worst news that we've come up with in this whole thing. I think it's important to put in perspective that they still benefited. Everybody benefited. It's just white students seem to have benefited enormously. Okay, quick cost effectiveness analysis. So this is what Lori and I worked on. Not this specific analysis, but this is the kind of analysis that Lori and I did in our National Academies study a while ago. I mentioned earlier that the reforms didn't come cheap. We spent $1,000 more per pupil than the comparison groups over this period of time. And so what we want to do is say, well, was that additional investment worthwhile from an economic analysis standpoint? So what I'm going to do here is compare to two other papers that I did. So one, a paper where I looked at the cost effectiveness of alternatives like class size reduction, pre-kindergarten, success for all, tutoring, and sort of did a catalog of studies at the time that we had really good evidence, and we also then created our own cost estimates and created this effectiveness cost ratio for each one. And then we did the same thing based on some college outcomes using college graduation as the outcome of interest. And so what we want to do is say, is this sort of reform more cost effective than these alternatives? Now just to sort of clarify one thing, I think the usual reaction I get to this thing is, how do you compare those things, right? How do you compare school choice and charter school reform with class size reduction? But the reason I think that's actually exactly the kind of comparison we want to make is that's what the debate is about. Right? The debate is about, should we put more resources into school? Should we focus on getting more kids to early childhood education? Should we be reducing class sizes? Or should we be reforming the way in which resources are used? That's the debate. So I think this is actually exactly the right way to look at it. Even though these things seem like, and indeed are, very different kinds of programs, that's the point, right? We have to figure out what kind of program we ought to be implementing. So here's what we find. The effectiveness cost ratio for the lower bounds that I showed you earlier and for the upper bound are in this vicinity. I'm not going to try to interpret the magnitudes. The key thing is that these things are a whole lot larger than these, right? That the cost effectiveness of the reforms was much higher than what we call a break even, meaning where the benefits equal the cost. They're much larger, 10 times larger than the Perry Preschool project in terms of test scores, and also about twice as big as the Tennessee STAR initiative for class size reduction. So it's not only effective, but it's cost effective by these measures. We also did the same thing based on the college outcomes. We haven't been able to analyze the college outcomes as deeply, but just looking descriptively at the improvements in college outcomes, which I haven't shown you here, we get a pretty similar result, that the reforms look more cost effective in getting students to college than, say, giving students more financial aid. All right. So just about to the end here, and I want to make sure and leave questions. So if you're starting to think of questions, please, we're going to leave some time for that. All right, so bottom line is we have large academic improvements. We have all subgroups benefiting, some more than others. I haven't talked about these intermediate outcomes. Maybe that's something we can talk about in the Q&A, like segregation and student mobility and all sorts of other things that we've been looking at. And that the effects are large relative to the cost. We're still doing a lot more on this. This is just the beginning of the work. We have a research center that I'm hoping will be able to continue studying what's going on in New Orleans for a long time. But we're looking at high school graduation next, college outcomes. We'll be able to bring the panel students back into the analysis because we lose them in 8th grade, but then they pick back up again for high school graduation and for college. And we're also looking at unintended consequences like segregation that I mentioned. So I want to conclude on this one point, because I think this is probably the most important thing for the audience, especially if there are any policymakers in the crowd thinking about what this means for decisions that they'll make. So I think there are a lot of reasons to think that we would not see these results elsewhere. So as positive as it is, it's probably an upper bound. So one reason is after Katrina, there was a large outpouring of compassion and a desire to help rebuild the city. So people come from all over the country to help rebuild New Orleans, including to the school system. And in the process, New Orleans became a national hub of school reform. So if you wanted to be a school reformer, if you wanted to start your own charter management organization, or if you wanted to create some new innovative nonprofit, New Orleans was a great place to come and to start off. So there was a lot of people wanted to come in ways that other cities wouldn't have that benefit. So Baton Rouge, which is just down the road from New Orleans, is trying to do exactly the same thing. They have a lot of trouble getting anybody to come to Baton Rouge, but not in the way, not like what we have in New Orleans. So we're not seeing the same kinds of effects there. Another issue is that New Orleans was so low performing to start with, right? So the way economists tend to think about this is a diminishing returns kind of argument, that if you're at the very bottom, it's easier to make gains from a reform like this. Whereas if you've already put in a reform, if you've already done something, then you can expect the next reform to have a smaller effect. So it very much then depends on your circumstances and what kinds of things are going on in your city. All right, so I think I will stop there and take questions.
We have a couple of folks with microphones in here to bring to you to answer questions so that everyone can hear both the questions and the responses. So if you have a question, if you kind of stick your hand in the air and do the hokey pokey and let us know that you would like the microphone, we'd be glad to bring it to you.
Well, thanks for an interesting talk. I guess my first question is, I think you showed data that New Orleans is about 98% black.
I think it's 88, but
88.
It's very high. Yeah.
And most of the effects for the black students were in the 0.2 range, a 0.15 range. So how can the upper bound really be 0.4? I mean, if you've got 88%.
So I think the issue is that I only showed you some of the results that got us to the 0.2 to 0.4. So most of the results, when I show you the average effects, because they're almost all black, those are basically the black effects. And I'm just pulling out, when I separate them, the effects on whites, for example, that's such a small group that it doesn't have that much of an effect on the average. So I think I see the discrepancy that you're seeing, and the only reason that's the case is that I couldn't show you all of the results. So we average across subjects and grades and all that to get to the numbers that I was showing you, and I couldn't show you all the numbers for the subgroups to show you where the average came from. So it's just a matter of how much I could show you on the slides, but. The way to think about the average effects is that those are the effects on blacks and that there are these other larger effects on whites. Other questions? Okay, I think I've got one here and then over here.
One of the problems with school choice has been, how do the students get to the school of their choice if it's 20 miles away?
It's a great question. So we have another study where we looked at this. This is the first study we did, actually, and the average distance to school attended increased by 2 miles. That's the average. So there was quite an increase, and the reason that was possible is that the Recovery School District, that's the state agency that became the authorizer and sort of took over the schools. They required the schools to provide transportation. So you have students who are getting up very early in the morning to get to the bus stop, to go on hour-long bus rides to get to school, and then hour-long bus rides to get home. I know I hear lots of anecdotes of students getting home at 6 o'clock at night from school, even in elementary school, because they're traveling so far to do it. But they do provide transportation to try to make the schools more accessible. That there is that side effect. It's also more expensive. A lot of the increase in funding, that $1,000 per pupil, I think like $400 of that is just an increase in transportation cost. Here.
I understand that the educational system in New Orleans is now in the hand of contractors. And I wonder how these contractors were selected in view of the ethicalness of the political groups that selected them.
No, that's a great question. So we have a study coming out on that too, fairly soon. One of my graduate students, Whitney Rubel, has been working on the authorizing process. That's what we call it. So they're all in New Orleans. Unlike a lot of cities, they're all nonprofits. So there are no. I think we're down to 0 for-profits that are operating or managing schools in New Orleans. That seems to be a deliberate attempt. That there were a lot of for-profits that applied, and there was initially, I think, 1 or 2 that got in, but then they were not reauthorized. So there is that. So that the contracting is contracting to nonprofits. So how does the process work? So it basically works like this: the Recovery School District contracts out with. There's yet another contract here. They contract out with somebody to help manage the process. And that group does their sort of own evaluation of a very long application. So there's an application that they usually come to somewhere between 300 and 1,000 pages of material that somebody has to submit to get something approved. So there's this external evaluation. Then the Recovery School District makes a recommendation to the state agency called BESI, the Bureau of Elementary and Secondary Education. Then they make the final call. So it's the state agency. That body is publicly elected. The 6 of them are publicly elected statewide, and then 3 of them are appointed by the governor. Yeah.
So looking at the discrepancy between the advantaged students and the disadvantaged students, are there any interventions from your study and everyone else's study that target that, or any reforms that kind of want to bridge that gap a little bit? And if so, what are they?
Right. No, that's a good question. So I think choice seems to have some part in it. So the study I mentioned on school choice that we did, we looked at how parents choose schools, and they choose differently. So one of the outcomes was that low-income families seem to place less emphasis on academics, or are less able to choose academically strong schools because of the practical considerations they have, like distance. So lower income families tend to live farther from higher performing schools, and even though there's bus transportation, they're still reluctant to send their child to a faraway place. So I think may be part of it, part of what's going on. That's hard to fix. It's hard to move. You can't move the families, and you can't easily move the schools either, at least not in the short term. So I think they are making efforts to try to do more outreach to families, to try to get information. There's a parents' guide where they send out these booklets far and wide, and also put it on the web for families to read. So they do go to substantial effort to try to deal with these problems. That it seems like there's still more to do there. Other questions? I see one back here.
If one wanted to make the case that a large part of the improvement was due to a better teaching corps, how hard would that case be?
I couldn't actually hear you.
I said if one wanted to make the case that a large part of the improvement seen was due to a better teaching corps, how hard would that case be?
Well, it's hard to make a case for anything, just in the sense that the package of reforms is so intertwined. However, I do think that teacher performance and teacher quality is sort of at the heart of it, because you fired all the teachers. The charter schools were clearly hiring different kinds of teachers, and they were then managing and leading those teachers under quite different policy regimes. And given what we know from other research about the importance of teacher quality and the variation in teacher performance across teachers, it seems very plausible to me. If I had to guess, I would say that the change in the teacher workforce and the changes in the management and leadership practices are taking those two things together is a big part of what's going on. But I have to say I'm speculating a bit when I say that, because it's very hard to isolate the effect of any one factor. I saw one over here.
What is the advantage of increasing the number of charter schools so much in New Orleans?
Well, great question. I think that's what we're testing, right? We're trying to see what effect that has. So no city has nearly that percentage. So New Orleans is at about 93%, I think, charter. The next closest is, I think, at about 55 nationally. So that's what we're trying to understand, what effect that has. I mean, the theory is that I think several things. One is that charter schools can have a strong sense of mission, and I think this is the thing that CMO leaders talk about a great deal in New Orleans. That they are mission-driven organizations, and that the school is the right unit for making decisions, perhaps even more so than the CMO. The CMO leaders also give a fair amount of autonomy to the schools. But I think they see the schools as being the right unit for decision making, and that's sort of the logic of the charter school, is to push decisions down to the school level and let school principals and people who are closer to the ground make those decisions without too many rules and too much bureaucracy over it. That's the theory. And I think the results here suggest that it's working, but again, hard to separate the charter school piece here from some of the other pieces. Back in the back.
How many charter authorizers are there in New Orleans or in the state of Louisiana? And what's the amount of time that the school has oversight, so an evaluation?
Right. So there are, I think it's correct to say that there are really two authorizers, the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education and school districts. So the other interesting thing that happened that I haven't had a chance to talk about is the school district still operates some schools, and some of those are now charter schools. So the district also decided to charter some of the schools under its authority. But when I say 93%, I'm taking the whole city combined, and so all of the Recovery School District schools are charters, and I think it's about half of the Orleans Parish School Board schools are charter. So it's only two. And it's an interesting question because the study that we're doing on authorizing highlights how different that process works in other places. So for example, in Michigan, it's primarily universities that are the authorizers of schools. So Eastern Michigan University, Central Michigan University, those are the largest authorizing agencies. And there's concern in those states that the universities are kind of not doing their jobs, in part because the universities get a cut of the revenue and may not have enough of an incentive to really provide oversight or close down a school, because it would actually cut into their own revenue. Other places it works still differently. So in California, for example, I think that the school districts are actually the most common authorizer. There are other authorizers in California, but the district is the most common authorizer. So, and that decision matters a great deal. I think this issue of local versus state control is quite a large one. And this system in New Orleans would look very different if only the school district could charter schools, or if only some locally elected body, as opposed to a state body, was making these decisions. You'd get a very different set of responses, especially on closure. So this gets to your second question, which is on the length of the contracts. They're usually 3 to 5 years. They can get renewals up to 10 years if their performance is very high. So there's legislative language about the circumstances under which a 10-year contract can be given, but they're usually in the 3 to 5 year range. Other questions? Lori.
So when the schools were reconstituted, did the facilities change? Did they reconstitute these new schools in the same rundown buildings, or did the students get new capital to play with?
So that was another thing that happened gradually. So FEMA gave about $1.8 billion to rebuild the schools, and that process is still playing out. So at the beginning, it was mostly the schools opening that hadn't been as heavily damaged, and then gradually renovating buildings, building some new buildings. That process is still playing itself out. So I think at this point, I would guess that probably 2/3 of the students, maybe a little bit more, are in buildings that have been heavily improved since the storm, and probably improved relative to the pre-Katrina period as well. Well, let me say one other thing, because you might be wondering, was that part of the effect? It could be, although most of that happened very much towards the end of that period, so a lot of the construction didn't even start until 2009. So it's possible, I think towards the end of, as we get close to 2012, that some of the 2012 effect could be from that, but it couldn't be very much, and it couldn't explain the upward trajectory before that.
So you said that students got to actually pick what schools they got to place. What kind of students got their first choice and who didn't? And how did that work out?
Great question. So we have a study on that. We're still working on that one. Who gets their first choice? That's almost the title of the paper. So I don't know the answer to that. I think I think 80% of students got one of their top 3 choices, if I'm remembering the numbers right. And I think it was in the neighborhood of 50%, maybe a little less, that got their first choice. So there are definitely some schools in quite high demand that not everybody can get into.
How many students are actually in the public schools now in the charter system compared to those that were in there before Katrina?
So we were at about 65,000 students before, and I think we're at about 49,000 now. So it's definitely smaller than what it was. Yeah. Other questions? Come on, there must be more.
I wanted to ask about the racial gaps in test scores that opened up. One is it seems like maybe that's one of the real takeaways. If we're going to say it's the system, it could be like, well, the system increases racial inequality. And the other one I wanted to ask about was, why do you think it causes that inequality to emerge?
So I don't think it's right to say that it increased inequality. I think that's too simple, because I think there are 2 different ways to think about inequality in this case. If you look at it on a statewide basis, it dramatically reduced inequality, right? Because you took an almost entirely black low-income district and moved it almost to the median in the state, right? So if you look at it at a statewide basis, it reduced inequality. If you look at it within the district, it looks like it increased inequality. So it depends. I mean, those are 2 very different ways of looking at it. So I think both perspectives are important. In terms of the reasons, I think I alluded to some of it earlier, that the choice process itself and the way in which decisions are being made about which schools students end up in, combined with the geography of choice and the geography of where schools are versus where the families are, is part of it. It's also possible, and again, here I'm definitely in the realm of speculation. This is one where we don't actually have a study on whether the schools are just better at educating more advantaged students, right? Because a lot of the teachers who came in, a lot of them are coming from more advantaged backgrounds, so maybe they're just better at dealing with students and helping students who are coming without so many challenges. And maybe they just still have work to do on the students who are struggling more. Certainly that's true in special education. So even the most diehard supporter of the reform effort will say that the first 4 or 5 years, special education was an absolute disaster in the city. Probably the same for English language learners. But that it's getting a lot better, and that they are making efforts now to try to rectify that. So I don't think we know enough about the reasons for that, but I think probably a lot of it is, unfortunately, all the same reasons why we have inequality in any school system, right? So we have inequality in the New Orleans system, in this reformed system, for reasons that may be a little bit distinctive, but a lot of the underlying processes are still the same. The same things that generate inequality in one system are going to be fairly similar, I think, to the factors doing that in other systems. Other questions?
Everybody, thank you so much for coming. Please help me in thanking Dr. Harris for his presentation. As you know, the Mosbacher Institute is very pleased to serve as host for events like this, and there will be a small reception in the lobby area after the talk, and Dr. Harris is not going to be allowed to escape. So if you have a question that you would like to ask him that you didn't want to ask in front of the crowd, I will hold him down, and you can catch him there. So please join us in the lobby for a brief reception.